Imagine a global alliance that promises security, unity, and shared defense. But behind the headlines of strategic gains and diplomatic triumphs lies a staggering financial reality that often goes unnoticed by the general public. NATO, established in 1949 to counter the Soviet threat, was originally a compact of just 12 nations. Yet over the decades it has grown far beyond its initial scope, incorporating countries across Eastern Europe and beyond. Each new addition bringing with it not just strategic advantages, but significant economic obligations that ripple through both the national budgets of member states and the collective finances of the alliance itself. While NATO often markets itself as a shield against potential aggressors, the costs of sustaining and expanding this shield are immense, and for citizens in member countries, these costs are not hypothetical. They are measurable, tangible, and sometimes staggering, forcing governments to allocate vast sums of money to defense spending at the expense of healthcare, education, infrastructure, and social programs that might otherwise improve quality of life. When a country joins NATO, it is expected to commit to the so-called 2% GDP target, a benchmark that requires nations to spend at least 2% of their gross domestic product on defense annually. And while 2% may sound modest in theory, in real numbers, it translates into billions of dollars. For example, Poland, with a GDP hovering around $700 billion, must direct approximately $14 billion each year into its military. Money that might otherwise fund hospitals, schools, or renewable energy projects, it is funneled instead into tanks, fighter jets, cybersecurity systems, and other military expenditures designed to meet NATO standards, and this calculation applies to each new member, meaning that every expansion of the alliance multiplies the financial burden across Europe and beyond. Beyond mere spending targets, NATO expansion necessitates massive infrastructure investments, as newly admitted countries must develop or modernize bases, command centers, logistics hubs, and training facilities, with the United States historically shouldering a disproportionately large share of these costs. American taxpayers, often unaware of the precise breakdown, end up financing tens of billions of dollars in construction, maintenance, technological upgrades that ensure NATO forces can operate seamlessly across borders. Yet this money is drawn from domestic coffers, representing opportunity costs in areas such as education reform, public transportation, or healthcare. And while these investments strengthen the alliance's military capacity, they also deepen the financial entanglement of member states in long-term commitments that may not yield immediate tangible benefits for the average citizen. Moreover, membership demands extensive modernization of equipment and capabilities, as NATO imposes standards to ensure interoperability among its forces. This requirement drives countries to purchase new tanks, advanced aircraft, surveillance drones, communication networks, and cybersecurity systems, often through foreign loans or aid packages that further strain national budgets, creating a paradox in which joining an alliance meant to provide collective security can simultaneously contribute to economic vulnerability, particularly in smaller nations whose economies may not be robust enough to absorb these sudden spikes in defense expenditure. Expansion extends even further, producing indirect economic consequences that can influence regional stability, international trade, and investor confidence, as tensions triggered by the presence of a larger militarily capable alliance can provoke responses from rival powers, leading to sanctions, countermeasures, or shifts in global supply chains. Markets react to perceived risk, currencies fluctuate, and foreign investment may slow in countries viewed as strategically exposed, meaning the security premium of NATO membership comes with hidden economic costs that often escape public scrutiny. Historical examples illustrate the weight of these financial obligations. When the Baltic states joined NATO in 2004, each was required to rapidly upgrade its military infrastructure and procurement, spending billions in a compressed time frame, often relying heavily on loans from international partners, while simultaneously attempting to maintain domestic programs and social services, a balancing act that placed extraordinary pressure on national finances. Poland and Romania faced similar challenges, channeling significant portions of their GDP into military spending to satisfy NATO expectations, demonstrating that expansion is not just a diplomatic or strategic maneuver, but a profound financial undertaking with real consequences for ordinary citizens. Additionally, the cumulative costs borne by the United States, the largest single contributor to NATO's operational budget, are immense. Billions of dollars are allocated each year to maintain forward-deployed forces, provide logistical support to allies, and invest in infrastructure upgrades, exercises, and rapid response capabilities across Europe. A level of spending that often exceeds the combined military budgets of multiple NATO countries, effectively transferring a substantial portion of the financial burden of European security onto American taxpayers, highlighting the asymmetry of responsibility within the alliance. Beyond the numerical calculations, human and societal implications of these financial commitments are significant. As governments face difficult decisions about prioritizing defense over domestic development, potentially slowing economic growth or limiting investment in crucial sectors such as technology, healthcare, and education, citizens may experience higher taxes, reduced social programs, or delayed public services as their governments honor obligations to maintain military readiness and modernize forces to meet NATO standards. Furthermore, the financial strain is compounded by geopolitical uncertainties. The presence of NATO in historically volatile regions can provoke tensions with neighboring countries, triggering an arms race, economic sanctions, and increased defense contracts that further escalate costs, creating a feedback loop in which security measures intended to deter conflict inadvertently generate additional financial and strategic pressures. In this context, NATO expansion emerges not as a purely strategic or political choice, but as a deeply financial one, where every new member represents billions in direct and indirect expenditures, infrastructure commitments, equipment modernization, and geopolitical risk mitigation. Understanding this reality is crucial for anyone trying to grasp the true cost of global military alliances, as the monetary stakes are as significant as the political and strategic considerations often highlighted in mainstream discourse. For policymakers, analysts, and citizens alike, recognizing the financial dimensions of NATO's growth underscores the complex trade-offs involved in maintaining collective security. The alliance provides deterrence and geopolitical influence, but these benefits come with tangible costs that affect national budgets, economic growth, and public welfare. By examining the historical trajectory of NATO expansion and the associated economic commitments, it becomes clear that the real cost extends far beyond troop deployments and strategic posturing. T is woven into the very fabric of national economies, influencing policy decisions, shaping budget priorities, and affecting the everyday lives of citizens in both new and long-standing member states. While these alliance continues to grow and geopolitical challenges evolve, the financial burden will only increase. It's making it imperative for both governments and the public to weigh the economic trade-offs alongside the security benefits, ensuring that discussions about NATO are grounded not just in strategic theory, but in a realistic understanding of the monetary realities that sustain it. Ultimately, the story of NATO expansion is as much about economics as it is about diplomacy or defense, revealing a hidden layer of costs and consequences that few outside of policy circles fully appreciate, yet which shape the decisions of nations, the allocation of resources, and the very nature of international security in the 21st century. Highlighting that the financial implications of military alliances are inseparable from the strategic narratives often presented in news headlines or political speeches. As NATO continues to expand eastward and integrate new member states, the financial implications for the United States become increasingly tangible, with American taxpayers shouldering a disproportionate share of the alliance's costs through direct military spending, infrastructure investments, and operational support that extend far beyond U.S. borders. And while headlines often highlight strategic benefits, the monetary reality is that sustaining NATO's presence in Europe and beyond represents one of the largest peacetime expenditures. In the American budget, compelling policymakers to make difficult choices about domestic priorities versus global commitments, and forcing ordinary citizens to indirectly fund the security of nations thousands of miles away through taxes that are funneled into complex programs designed to modernize military equipment, maintain forward-deployed troops, and support the development of allied forces. The United States has long carried a unique burden within NATO, contributing roughly 70% of the alliance's overall operational budget, a figure that translates into tens of billions of dollars annually. And while this investment strengthens the collective defense posture and allows the U.S. to project power and influence across key regions, it also places significant strain on the federal budget, particularly at a time when domestic issues such as healthcare, education, infrastructure, and social welfare demand considerable resources, creating a constant tension between global security commitments and the needs of the American population. Every new NATO member increases the scope of these obligations, as the U.S. is often called upon to provide logistical support, advanced military technology, and training assistance to ensure interoperability and readiness. And the scale of these investments is enormous, constructing and maintaining bases across Eastern Europe, deploying troops and equipment on rotational assignments, funding joint exercises, and upgrading communication and cybersecurity systems all require sustained financial input, often stretching over decades. And these expenditures are funded not only through defense budgets, but indirectly through federal debt, further complicating the long-term economic picture for the country. Beyond the immediate costs of personnel and infrastructure, NATO expansion also drives increased procurement of advanced military hardware, with American defense contractors benefiting from billions of dollars in contracts to supply tanks, fighter jets, missile defense systems, and intelligence technology to allied nations, which in turn ensures that member states meet NATO standards, but also results in a continual outflow of taxpayer dollars into foreign military aid, equipment financing, and technology transfers, representing a subtle yet substantial cost that many citizens may not immediately recognize. The presence of U.S. forces in Europe and the funding required to maintain readiness also have ripple effects. Domestically, as Congress must balance competing priorities, often leading to budget compromises or reallocation of funds from domestic programs to maintain overseas commitments. And while the strategic argument for these expenditures emphasizes deterrence against potential adversaries and the projection of American influence, the economic reality is that taxpayers effectively subsidize the security infrastructure of multiple countries, creating a complex web of fiscal responsibilities that extends far beyond the borders of the United States. Historical examples highlight the magnitude of this financial commitment. The deployment of U.S. troops and the modernization of Allied forces in the Baltic states, Poland, and Romania after NATO expansion in 2004 required billions in infrastructure upgrades, equipment transfers, and training programs. With the U.S. providing the bulk of these resources, and more recently, initiatives to reinforce Eastern Europe in response to rising geopolitical tensions have led to additional billions in spending on troop rotations, missile defense, and logistical support, illustrating how NATO commitments translate directly into long-term budgetary obligations that impact federal spending priorities and, by extension, the everyday lives of American citizens. Moreover, these expenditures are not isolated to physical assets. They encompass long-term contractual obligations, maintenance costs, and continuous operational readiness programs that effectively lock in future spending, limiting flexibility for policymakers and creating a situation where strategic decisions are inextricably linked to financial realities. And as new members join, or as threats evolve, the U.S. faces pressure to increase funding, further reinforcing a cycle in which taxpayer money is committed to sustain an alliance that spans continents and involves numerous nations, each with its own economic and political considerations. The economic burden of NATO expansion also intersects with domestic political debates, as questions arise about whether the costs justify the security benefits, particularly when U.S. citizens face growing concerns over infrastructure decay, healthcare affordability, student debt, and social welfare. These trade-offs are not theoretical, as billions of dollars spent overseas could alternatively be invested in roads, schools, hospitals, and renewable energy projects at home, highlighting the tension between global leadership and domestic responsibility, and making the discussion about NATO not just a matter of foreign policy, but a critical economic conversation with real consequences for millions of Americans. Furthermore, the indirect financial impacts must be considered, including how NATO commitments influence international trade, investor confidence, and geopolitical risk assessments, which in turn affect the U.S. economy, currency valuation, and business environment. creating a multidimensional financial landscape in which taxpayers bear both the direct costs of defense spending and the broader economic consequences of strategic decisions made on the global stage. Ultimately, understanding the American financial stake in NATO expansion requires a holistic perspective, recognizing that each additional member country increases obligations in terms of troops, infrastructure equipment, and ongoing operational support, and that these obligations are funded through taxpayer dollars that could be deployed in other areas to improve domestic quality of life. And while the strategic and diplomatic arguments for NATO membership remain compelling, the economic reality is that sustaining the alliance represents one of the most significant peacetime fiscal commitments in American history, intertwining national security with economic sacrifice in ways that are often underappreciated in public discourse. By examining the cumulative effect of these expenditures, it becomes evident that the cost of NATO expansion is not merely an abstract figure in a budget line item, but a tangible series of commitments that influence policymaking, shape federal priorities, and directly affect citizens' lives through taxation, service allocation, and long-term debt obligations. And as global dynamics continue to evolve, the pressure to maintain readiness, support allied nations, and invest in strategic deterrence ensures that American taxpayers will remain central to the financial equation, highlighting the delicate balance between leadership on the world stage and responsibility at home, and emphasizing that the true cost of NATO expansion extends far beyond maps and military strategy into the very economic fabric of the nation. The story of U.S. involvement in NATO expansion is thus as much about economics as it is about diplomacy or defense, illustrating that behind every strategic maneuver lies a complex financial reality, and that understanding the full scope of American contributions provides essential insight into the broader debate over global alliances, fiscal responsibility, and the trade-offs inherent in maintaining a position of international leadership, where billions of taxpayer dollars are continuously allocated to support collective security, often at the expense of domestic development, yet with the promise of long-term geopolitical stability and deterrence, a promise whose value is constantly weighed against the tangible costs borne by everyday citizens. As NATO continues to expand and evolve, the financial implications extend far beyond immediate military spending, intertwining with complex geopolitical dynamics that carry both risks and long-term economic consequences for member nations and their citizens. And while previous chapters have examined the direct costs to individual countries and the disproportionate burden on the United States, it is equally important to understand how future expansions and strategic commitments could reshape the global financial landscape, influence international relations, and create cascading effects that touch everything from national budgets to investor confidence and regional stability. Each new member added to NATO brings not only increased obligations for defense spending, infrastructure development, and military modernization, but also introduces potential flashpoints that could escalate tensions with neighboring countries, prompting arms races, sanctions, and retaliatory measures that carry both economic and security costs. These indirect financial pressures are often overlooked in public discourse, yet they are a critical component of the alliance's long-term fiscal reality, as governments must prepare for contingencies, maintain readiness, and invest in strategic deterrence measures that require billions in recurring expenditure, sometimes without any guarantee of conflict avoidance. The expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe and potentially into other regions introduces strategic complexity, as rival powers perceive such moves as threats, prompting them to respond with military buildups, economic countermeasures, or diplomatic pressure, all of which have real, world financial repercussions. For member nations, this means that the cost of security is not static, but evolves with the geopolitical climate, requiring adaptive spending strategies, continuous upgrades to military infrastructure, and sustained investment in technology and intelligence systems, which collectively increase national and alliance-level budgets. Furthermore, the economic burden of these geopolitical risks is not confined to defense alone, as tensions can impact trade flows, foreign investment, currency stability, and energy markets, creating ripple effects that touch domestic economies in subtle but significant ways, meaning that taxpayers are indirectly financing not only military operations but also the economic insulation required to mitigate potential instability. caused by global conflicts, sanctions, or political uncertainty. For smaller NATO members, these financial pressures are particularly acute, as even minor increases in defense spending can represent a substantial portion of national GDP, forcing governments to prioritize alliance commitments over domestic development, infrastructure, or social programs. And while these countries benefit from the collective security offered by NATO, the trade-off often manifests in delayed economic growth, increased debt, or constrained public services, highlighting the multifaceted costs of expansion beyond the obvious military expenditures. Looking ahead, the future financial implications of NATO's growth are complex. The alliance must navigate emerging threats, such as cyber warfare, advanced missile systems, and unconventional conflicts, each requiring substantial investment in technology, training, and intelligence capabilities. And these costs are compounded as NATO considers integrating new members in strategically sensitive regions, where political, economic, and security factors intersect in unpredictable ways. American taxpayers, once again, are at the center of this equation as the U.S. continues to underwrite a significant portion of NATO operations. From troop deployments to joint exercises and technological transfers, ensuring interoperability across the alliance while absorbing the fiscal impact of potential crises triggered by expansion, confrontation, or shifting alliances. The balance between sustaining global leadership and managing domestic economic priorities becomes increasingly delicate, requiring transparent discussions about costs, benefits, and long-term obligations. In essence, NATO's expansion represents not just a strategic or political decision, but an ongoing financial commitment whose magnitude grows with every new member and every emerging threat, illustrating that collective security is inseparable from collective expenditure, and that the true cost of maintaining an effective alliance is measured not only in dollars spent today, but in the financial resilience required to respond to future challenges, from regional conflicts to technological disruption. Understanding the intersection of geopolitical risk and fiscal responsibility is essential for evaluating NATO's trajectory, as the alliance's growth carries both promises of enhanced security and the reality of escalating economic obligations, reminding policymakers, analysts, and citizens alike that the price of global defense is perpetual, evolving, and often hidden behind the headlines. Yet it profoundly shapes the financial landscape of member nations and the lives of their taxpayers. By acknowledging these realities, we gain a more nuanced understanding of NATO expansion, not merely as a military or diplomatic endeavor, but as a continuous balancing act between strategic necessity and financial sustainability. A balance that will define the alliance's future, the economic stability of its members, and the broader dynamics of global security for decades to come.